welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share Dogman encounters I came across on the internet. These stories include a boy who was chased by a huge creature in Oklahoma, a man who was stalked by something while hunting in North Carolina, and one of the most compelling encounters I've ever heard that involves a Dogman, a UFO sighting, and a Yowie. But first, we start with a story from a poster whose friends saw something and then showed him the tracks it left behind when they were young. Before we get started, I just want to say that a lot of people turn to posting their stories online because they feel like they can't tell anyone and would be seen as crazy if they did. Most people who experience these beings are traumatized and feel the need to unburden themselves or just have someone who will believe them listen to their story. If you've had an encounter and you feel like you can't tell anyone for fear of being made fun of, ridiculed, called a liar, or any other reason, email me. You'll find a sympathetic ear here who will believe you. I do want to mention that just because you email me your story, it doesn't mean it will end up in an episode on my channel. Your story can stay between me and you if that's what you want. Also, if you've had an encounter and you'd like to come on an episode and tell your story, email me. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who shares their friend's encounter with a Dogman in Michigan. He and his friend were around 11 years old at the time of his friend's encounter, which took place in the woods behind his home in Byron Center. Byron Center is located in the Lower Peninsula just south of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The original poster's friend was never one to make up stories, so he had no reason to not believe him when he said he saw something unusual, but just assumed that it was only a wolf or a coyote. His friend then led him into the woods, and after about a 10-minute walk, they stumbled upon some incredibly large paw prints. He was only 10 at the time, and he says it was likely just a common animal, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease when looking upon them. Not just because of the size of the paw prints, but also the distance between them, as if something massive had been sprinting through the area. I know as far as encounter stories go, this isn't one of the most exciting, but I also find it very interesting when there is physical evidence left behind by one of these beings, and that's why I included it in this episode. That and sometimes encounters aren't going to be that exciting, with someone being chased or put in mortal danger in every situation. Now I know these prints could have very well belonged to a normal animal, but when he talks about just how big they were, the distance between them, it makes me think it was a Dogman. Especially given that his friend claimed to see one and he said he had no reason not to believe him. Plus, anytime there's physical evidence to back up a sighting, it always helps someone's case. What do you think about this one? Do you think his friend saw a Dogman? And what do you think the paw prints belong to? The next story comes from a poster who had an unsettling encounter after returning from a hunting trip with his grandfather. This story takes place in Waurika Lake, Oklahoma, when he was around 12 or 13 years old. Waurika Lake is located in the southern part of the state, not all that far from the Texas state line. At the time of his encounter, he was outside playing and enjoying the fresh air while waiting for his grandfather to finish preparing dinner. They had just returned from a great deer hunt, and he decided to get their fishing poles ready for the next morning. However, being that it was nighttime, he needed a flashlight. As he made his way to the storage shed, an unsettling feeling washed over him. It was something he says he had never experienced before. It felt like he was being stalked by something. Despite the eerie sensation, he reached the storage shed and gathered their fishing gear. Just as he was finishing up, though, his grandfather called him, prompting him to run back to the trailer. That's when he heard the sound of large dog footfalls behind him. However, there were no big dogs in the area. Nick surged through him and he remembers he had left his flashlight behind. He glanced back as he ran and caught a glimpse of glowing eyes belonging to something massive. Fear propelled him to run even faster until he finally burst into the trailer. His grandfather looked at him, puzzled by his terrified expression. He told his grandfather what happened, half expecting him to dismiss his story. But, to his surprise, he believed his grandson's tale. He mentioned it could have been a Dogman or a Wendigo and revealed that he had heard noises around the trailer while his grandson was outside. To this day, the original poster firmly believes it was a Dogman he encountered that night. One commenter asked him if he had experienced anything after that night, and being that his grandfather believed him without question, if his grandfather had ever experienced anything with that creature or anything else. The original poster responded by saying that his grandfather had always told him stories and strongly believed that these kinds of things existed. Also, they had woken up one morning with their fishing equipment strewn all across the yard. There would be nothing scarier for a 12 or 13-year-old, or anyone for that matter, to be chased by something in the dark, especially something that big. But then for them to turn and see glowing eyes that belonged to something huge would be even more disconcerting. I'm just glad he was able to get inside without further incident and that his grandfather believed him without question. I know I bring this up all the time, but it's always good when the person who has an encounter has someone who believes their story. A lot of people feel like they can't tell anyone what happened to them for fear of being labeled crazy or worse. The fact that his grandfather believed him without question makes me think he had also experienced or seen something around their home. What do you think about this one? What would you do if you were outside at night and something like that started chasing you? Also, do you think the grandfather has had an encounter of his own? The next story comes from a poster who shared their encounter upon being asked by people to tell their story. At the time, which was 23 years before he posted his story online, he didn't even know what a Dogman was and did not believe in anything supernatural. His encounter happened near the Albemarle Sound in eastern North Carolina when he was hunting wild hogs in the Great Dismal Swamp. The day of his encounter, he had launched his boat from his friend's house, roughly a half-hour journey by water to the swamp entrance. It was late November and the chill in the air was palpable, with an overcast sky overhead. The sun dipped below the horizon around 5 p.m., so he knew he had to make the most of the daylight he had. He secured his boat and stepped out of it around noon. The first hour passed without much excitement as he navigated deeper into the swamp. The area he was in was walkable during low tides, revealing marshy ground interspersed with deeper canals and bogs. However, there were no trails or signs to guide you, so staying alert was crucial. A compass was essential since the sun was often obscured, and even on the brightest days, the swamp could feel quite dim. He had been in the area for about 2 hours searching for any signs of wild hogs. There were clear signs that they had passed through at some point, but it looked to him like it had been a while since their last visit. As he ventured deeper, he caught a whiff of what he initially thought was a boar. With it being rutting season, male hogs emit a very distinct scent, what he describes as musky and somewhat fermented, mixed with feces and urine. He says it's a tough smell to describe if you haven't encountered it before. However, the scent that day was different. It had a musky quality he describes as smelling like an outdoor dog that is soaking wet. He paused to look and listen, and after about 10 minutes he began to hear a soft snuffling sound followed by an intermittent breathing. Then came the growling, which made him uneasy because it didn't sound like a hog, and whatever the growling was coming from seemed big. He crouched down and scanned a thick brush around him, which limited his visibility to about 20 feet in every direction. That's when he began noticing something moving, and it certainly wasn't the way a hog would move. It appeared to be low to the ground, walking in a crouched position, but not quite on all fours. He could only catch brief glimpses of this thing, and then it would freeze in place. It was probably about 40 feet away by his estimation. At that point, he truly started to get scared. He says that growing up in northeastern Kentucky, he spent countless hours in the woods as a kid, camping, riding dirt bikes, and always feeling at ease, even in the deep woods. As a result, when he relocated to North Carolina, he quickly developed a fondness for the swamp. Yet this was the first time he genuinely experienced real fear there. He had his Mossberg 590 shotgun loaded with double-aught buckshot, but he was out of extra shells and didn't have a pistol. The 590 also featured a bayonet lug, so he decided to attach the bayonet. He began backing away then, keeping his eyes fixed on the last spot where he saw what he now knew was out there with him, whatever it might be. A few minutes go by and he heard this thing moving again, this time a bit to his left. He was about 3/4 of a mile into the swamp, which he says may not seem like much, but the uneven ground made it tough to move quickly. For the next 20 minutes, he continued to retreat as quickly as possible while hearing this thing following him and catching glimpses of its movement. All the while, the smell was growing more intense. Eventually, the unsettling realization that this creature had positioned itself between him and his boat settled over him, and panic started to set in. He attempted to distance himself from it while heading in the right direction, and then he spotted it again, standing upright on its hind legs, and it was very tall. But it remained hidden in the underbrush, making it hard to discern any details about it as it was very dark in there. Fear gripped him, and he felt the urge to flee, but knew that it would be a mistake. The creature didn't seem inclined to enter the water, so he began wading through the canal, trying to make his way back to his boat. As he started putting some distance between himself and this thing, he reached solid ground and picked up his pace, but he could still hear it snuffling, growling, and moving through the brush, though it was no closer to him. When he finally made it back to his boat, he was drenched and shivering, and thanked God he escaped when he did, because fog began to roll in and it started drizzling. He says he had never experienced fear like that before. Once he reached his friend's house and told him what happened, he could see in his friend's eyes that he knew something when he mentioned where he was during his encounter. He and his friend went inside and he handed the OP a steaming cup of coffee spiked with a generous splash of bourbon. After he calmed down, his friend led him to a small house behind his property where his grandfather lived. He had met him before, but he had always seemed a bit distant. Later, he learned that the grandfather suffered from severe PTSD from his time in Korea. His friend's family had deep roots in the area, having lived there since the Civil War, which meant that they knew the land far better than he did. After sharing his experience with his friend's grandfather, he stood up, looked at him in the eye, and told him not to go back in there, that he's lucky he made it out, and that the area he was in is where the, quote, big dogs live. After speaking with his friend's grandfather, he left and headed home. When he got there, he slept for about 18 hours straight. He tried to push the experience out of his mind, trying to convince himself he was just seeing things and freaking himself out over nothing. For years, he managed to forget about it until a few years back when a video about Dogman encounters popped up in his YouTube recommendations. Intrigued by the term Dogman, he clicked on it and suddenly all the memories came rushing back. The stories were strikingly similar to what he had gone through, and when he began to dig deeper, he discovered that there had been other sightings and encounters reported in eastern North Carolina. He still resides in coastal North Carolina, but he hasn't ventured back into that area. He continues to enjoy hunting and being outdoors, especially in the swamps, but he's more cautious about how far he wanders into them. It's one thing when someone has an encounter with one of these beings, but for the creature to stalk someone and then seemingly be moving to try to cut them off from their avenue of escape is absolutely terrifying. It shows the intelligence they have, whether it be instinctual or otherwise. From what I've gathered in my deep dive into the cryptid subject, these creatures have an intelligence that extend beyond instinctual, especially when it comes to Dogman. They demonstrate this over and over. During this encounter, the Dogman seemed to be hunting by the sound of it. That's my opinion though, so take it for what it's worth. If that is the case, that's disturbing, and the grandfather was right when he said that he was lucky to have made it out of there. There's no telling what would have happened if he hadn't tried to go through the water to get to his boat. I do want to mention that it's good his experience didn't rob him of something he loves, like hunting and being outdoors, like what happens in so many other stories. There are so many encounters where this does happen to people and they quit camping, hunting, hiking, and other outdoor activities because of a traumatic encounter. And who could blame them? But in this case, the original poster didn't let that happen. but does steer clear of the area where he had his encounter, which is very smart. What do you think about this one? Would an encounter like that keep you from continuing outdoor activities? The final story of this episode comes to us from Australia, where one user shared his encounter with a dogman that also involved a UFO and a Yowie. I have to say that this is one of the most compelling stories I have ever come across. For those of you who aren't familiar with a Yowie, it's a Sasquatch-like creature native to Australia that was first sighted in the early 19th century by European settlers. They are also prominent in Aboriginal legend and folklore and described as being anywhere from 6 to 12 feet tall, very large, covered in hair, and bipedal. The original poster says he didn't believe in Dogman before his encounter, or any other cryptid really, other than Bigfoot, and of course Yowie, being that he lives in Australia. But he didn't give them much attention though, believing that they were further north from where he lived. At the time, he lived near Victoria, near Yarra Valley. His property, which backs up to the Yarra Ranges National Park, was heavily forested. The Yarra Ranges National Park is located in the Central Highlands, which is in southeastern Victoria and is approximately 107 kilometers or 66.5 miles northeast of Melbourne. It was established in 1995 and covers a total area of 760 square kilometers or 293.4 square miles. The original poster's strange experiences began one evening when he was walking around his land. Out of the blue, a bright flash above the trees to his right caught his attention, followed immediately by another to his left. He says it felt as if something was messing with him. Glancing down, he paused, then quickly looked back up, and then there it was, a massive flash the size of a basketball right in front of him. He was completely baffled, and he wondered if it was a UFO. The following night he returned, but before he even reached the spot, an intense sense of dread washed over him, and he describes it as if someone were approaching him with a knife. A voice echoed in his mind then, urging him to run, and he took off. He felt sick after the bizarre experience. This compelled him to seek answers, and he began to notice typical signs of Yowies, in the form of stick formations, whooping calls, heavy footsteps, broken trees, and saplings twisted and jammed into the ground. It dawned on him that they were aware of his presence, so he started documenting everything with photos. However, he stopped taking the pictures, fearing that he might make them mad. Then he witnessed a silent light flying overhead. But it was not an aircraft. There was no noise, no blinking lights, and it didn't match any flight paths that he checked. The light moved toward the same area where he had seen the earlier flashes and appeared to land. Not long after, another light joined it, and then they both vanished. That night, he was startled by more unusual sounds, a very peculiar owl hoot he had never heard before. This prompted him to close all of his blinds due to an anxious feeling that came over him. In an effort to establish a connection, he researched Yowies and walked around his property, speaking loudly and leaving fruit as an offering, which he says he later learned was a bad idea. At one point, he heard a strange quote, "Hello human," in his mind, something later he learned is referred to as mind speak. The voice informed him that it was the one who had warned him to flee, explaining that the flashing lights were linked to the creature they referred to as, quote, "Pigface." He wasn't sure if that's a nickname or if it truly resembled a pig, but it was unsettling for him nonetheless. He had a few more exchanges with the Yowie's voice, and it wasn't always clear, but he could make sense of what it was saying. One day, as he walked his property, a young creature caught his attention. It stood about 4 feet tall and resembled a gorilla. In an instant, it darted away with astonishing speed, then became translucent and disappeared. When this happened, his daughter exclaimed that she had saw a monkey. Her description matched exactly what he saw. He explained to her that it was a Yowie, and she was thrilled to hear that. Ever since that encounter, he felt a special bond with that young one, even though he had only seen it the one time. It had a playful spirit, according to him, and there were countless stories he could share about. His Dogman encounter began when he discovered unusual tracks alongside the Yowie prints. Footprints that seemed to be a bizarre blend of a dog and a kangaroo, but on a much larger scale. He didn't pay much attention to them at all until one day, while attempting to connect mentally with the Yowies, he was struck by a terrifying vision of a grotesque dog-like creature. It was a disturbing experience for him and prompted him to delve into Dogman research. It wasn't long after this that he began noticing glowing eyes peering at him from the bushes, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of hatred directed at him. He says that while those eyes could have belonged to owls, he was terrified by them. When he tried to discuss this with the Yowies, they responded with a single word: wolf. Panic set in, and shortly thereafter he began discovering chewed up dog toys and tennis balls despite not having a dog. He says it could have been the Yowies messing with him, but he couldn't be sure. One day he could have sworn he heard heavy panting nearby. He reached out to someone he calls his Yowie researcher, and they speculated that it might have been a Dogman, even though there hadn't been any reported sightings in the vicinity. By that point, he was too afraid to walk to his car at night because every sound felt to him like a Dogman was lurking nearby. Then one night he made the mistake of leaving his bedroom blinds open, and that's when he saw it, a massive creature right outside his window. He caught a fleeting glimpse of its black fur, which he says was about 2 to 3 inches long and part of its skin. The texture was unlike anything he had ever seen before, and he describes it as looking like a, quote, monstrous detailed armor. He quickly looked away, remembering some advice to avoid eye contact. The sighting left him paralyzed by fear. A few days later, he decided to leave some meat bones outside as a peace offering and as an apology, hoping to put an end to the unsettling situation. Not long after this, he experienced another telepathic encounter. This one was much clearer and more straightforward than the previous mind speak with the Yowie. This time, a female Dogman revealed that he had stumbled upon her den where she was raising her pups, and she was furious about it. A stark warning was issued. If he ever disclosed their location, she would take his daughter's life. The mental pressure felt like a tight vice-like grip around his head. He experienced anger, hatred, and felt conflicted. He sought alternatives to the situation, but the intensity of the pressure left him with no option, leaving him with no other choice but to agree. When he did, the pressure lifted instantly. But a sense of shame lingered after. He somehow knew that she was just protecting her young. It also felt more like she was pleading with him. After that, though, he made sure to keep his daughter close. Following that, several more telepathic exchanges occurred. He believed that the female Dogman was trying to gauge his thoughts to ensure that he was honoring his promise, as she remained cautious and offered no information. He suspected at the time of posting his story that she and her family had since moved on. And ever since that ordeal, he has felt much more comfortable in the bush. He is more respectful of the area and is careful about where he goes while walking. The Yowies still seem to be active from time to time. He notices red eye shine and hears unusual crashing sounds, along with tree breaks and twists. However, he thinks the original ones he communicated with have left for the winter and may return in the summer. He ends by asking anyone who reads his incredible encounters what they think. He wants to know if it was really a Dogman or if it was just the Yowies messing with him. He also wonders if the, quote, pig face referred to by the Yowies was the Dogman. The last thing he points out is the difference in the mind speak he experienced with each of these beings. The Yowie's mind speak was broken and vague, while the Dogman communicated in a much more clear way that he says was sharp and intrusive. He believes that the Dogman could read his mind. As I mentioned in the intro to this story, this is one of the most compelling encounters I've ever heard. Not only do we have a detailed description of mind speak, but we have an account of 2 different types of cryptids using it and how they differ. Based on everything I've heard about Dogman, the way this one interacted with the OP was exactly what I'd expect, right down to him feeling pure hatred from this thing. I found it both fascinating and disturbing when he talked about the feelings that came over him and his inability to deny her request. Not that he would have anyway, but for the Dogman to be able to manipulate him like that is just plain scary. A few more things I wanted to mention about the Dogman are the hatred he felt toward him coming from it coming up to his window at night, and it seemingly keeping tabs on him. All of these things, along with him mentioning how it felt interacting with it, point to it being extremely intelligent and even cunning. How terrifying it must have been for this thing, a monster straight out of a nightmare, to threaten his daughter. I find that very unsettling, and it didn't even happen to me, so I can't even imagine how he must have felt. Another thing he needs to be careful with is carrying on a relationship with these creatures. I would strongly recommend against it, even if they do seem friendly. I've heard too many times how badly these things can go with just one wrong misstep, or something that can be misconstrued as a misstep by them. Also, this isn't the first story I've heard where UFO and cryptid activity happen in the same area. Well, I guess I should say if those strange lights were in fact UFOs, but it certainly seems that way. There are plenty of theories about the connection between cryptids and UFOs, and when I hear a story like this, even though they didn't overlap, it really makes me wonder. The last thing I want to mention is how he described the young Yowie turning translucent and vanishing into thin air. There have been many encounters, and there are many theories where these things seem to be able to cloak themselves and seem to turn invisible, but really it's just a camouflage mechanism and a way for them to escape. It also points to the fact that they can be there 1 second and just gone the next. What do you think about this story? And what do you think about the differences he describes in the mind speak between the Yowie and the Dogman? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.